My name is Evelyn Monroe, and at 67, I used to believe I had already lived through every kind of heartbreak life could throw at a woman my age. I thought nothing could shake the quiet rhythm of my days here in Columbus, Ohio, where mornings smelled of early rain and afternoons drifted by with the calm predictability that only comes after raising children, settling debts, and surviving decades of marriage. Yet I found myself sitting by my kitchen window every morning, my hands curled around a mug of tea I no longer tasted, staring through the pale fog as if the mist might whisper answers to questions I was too afraid to voice aloud. Something in my home, in my marriage, in my life, had shifted in a way that left a cold knot in my stomach. My husband, Harold, was 70, but age had been kind to him. He still carried himself with the confidence of a man who once managed a successful contracting business, the kind of man neighbors trusted and friends admired. For most of our 40-plus years together, he had been dependable, if not perfect, sometimes gruff, sometimes stubborn, but loyal in the ways that mattered. Or so I believed. That belief held me together for decades, a steady anchor. Lately, though, that anchor felt like it was slipping loose, drifting into waters I could no longer read. Harold began caring more about his appearance than he ever had. He trimmed his beard every couple of days, pressed his shirts smooth even for grocery runs, and wore cologne so strong it lingered in the air long after he left the house. He whistled while dressing, hummed to himself in the mirror like a man preparing for a date rather than an afternoon of errands. At first, I chalked it up to boredom, to the way older men sometimes try to feel younger when retirement gives them too much time to think. But then his new routines started revolving around one place, and one person, my son's house, where only my daughter-in-law was home. My boy, Travis, works construction. He chases projects wherever they take him. Michigan 1 month, Indiana the next, trying to save enough money to buy a place of his own. That left his wife, Maribel, alone for weeks at a time in their little rental house 5 streets over. She was a quiet young woman, raised in New Mexico before moving to Ohio with Travis, and she'd always been polite with me, shy almost, her eyes soft and downturned whenever someone praised her cooking or complimented her gentle manner. She had seemed like a blessing to the family, the kind of woman who listens more than she speaks. Yet the more Harold visited her, the more I noticed a strange electricity in the air between them. He found endless excuses to stop by her house. A flickering porch light, a crooked fence panel, a leaky faucet, things he never cared about in our own home unless I reminded him 3 times. He began carrying tools in his truck again, like a man who suddenly wanted to be useful, indispensable even. Every time he came back from her place, his cheeks held a faint color they rarely had anymore, and there was a lift in his step that left my heart restless. He talked about Maribel with a softness I didn't recognize. She's a sweet girl, he'd say, too young to be stuck alone all the time. I wanted to believe his concern was fatherly, just an old man trying to help, but a woman who has lived through as many seasons as I have knows when a gaze lingers too long, when a smile means too much. I caught the way he looked at her across our dinner table when she joined us on Sundays. His eyes warmed in a way that didn't belong to a father-in-law. And she blushed far too easily, her fingers fidgeting with her fork, her voice barely above a whisper when he asked if she was doing all right. There was something timid in her expression, yet something else beneath it too, something like a nervous spark. Every night after Harold fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was imagining it, that this paranoia was simply age playing tricks on my mind. But no matter how hard I pressed my palm against my chest, the unsettled feeling only grew heavier. I found myself watching Harold's shoes by the front door, noticing how often they disappeared, how late he returned, how he smelled like rain and cologne and something else, something unfamiliar. I listened to him shower at odd hours, humming quietly, as if washing away a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. The day everything cracked open began with rain, the kind that sheets down the windows and makes the sky look bruised. Harold grabbed his jacket and said he needed to check the gutters at Travis and Maribel's place. "Won't be long," he said. Just a quick fix. I watched the clock. 1 hour passed. Then another. My tea went cold. My fingertips tapped the table. When we'd been younger, Harold always came back when he said he would. Something about that promise won't be long echoed in my chest like a warning. By the 3rd hour, I could no longer sit still. I slipped on my raincoat, braced myself against the wind, and walked into the storm. My steps felt heavier the closer I came to their street. I prayed with every breath that I would find Harold fixing a gutter, exactly as he said, and that all the unease gnawing at me for months would dissolve into embarrassment and relief. But deep down, beneath my ribs, I already knew the truth was waiting for me behind a door I never wanted to open. When I reached my son's street, the rain was coming down so hard it felt like the sky was scolding me, pelting my coat and stinging my cheeks. The houses blurred behind sheets of water, and every breath tasted metallic, like fear itself had settled on my tongue. As I approached Travis and Maribel's driveway, the hairs on my arms rose before I even understood why. Harold's truck was parked neatly beside the curb, its windshield wipers frozen mid-stroke, droplets sliding down the hood like tears. That alone made my pulse trip. Harold never left his truck out in the rain if he planned to come right back out. The front door, a cheap white rental door that always stuck in the winter, wasn't even latched. It stood pulled almost shut, but not fully. A tiny, careless gap. Harold was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. Not with doors. Not with anything that might reflect on him. The sight of that inch-wide crack made something cold and knowing bloom in my stomach. I stepped onto the porch, every board creaking under my sodden shoes. The porch light flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows on the wet concrete. Through the guttering rain, I could hear nothing but the roar of water hitting pavement until I took one more step forward. Then something shifted. A muffled sound. Soft. Rhythmic. Almost swallowed by the storm, but unmistakably human. I pressed my ear toward the door. At first it was impossible to distinguish just faint rustling. Then a breathy sound. Then a small giggle light, breathless, intimate. My heart, already fragile, clenched so hard I had to steady myself on the doorknob. No one giggles like that when fixing a gutter. No one laughs like that over pipes or tools or clogged drains. Lightning cracked so brightly it lit the entire room on the other side of the curtains, and for a split second, the shadows moved in ways no married man and his daughter-in-law ever should. I reached for the curtain beside the living room window, the one Maribel always forgot to close during her Sunday visits. It hung crooked from a broken plastic ring, leaving a tiny gap small enough to ignore, large enough to reveal a world I prayed wasn't real. Rain beaded on my eyelashes as I leaned closer. Through that narrow slit came a warm yellow glow, the kind that usually signals comfort, safety, home. But what I heard behind it made my bones tremble. A low moan. A breathless whisper. Another stifled giggle. A voice, Harold's voice, soft in a way I had never heard from him, not since we were 25 and newly in love. My hand trembled as I touched the curtain's edge. I didn't want to look. God knows I begged myself not to look. But something stronger than fearsome, cruel, ancient instinct to witness the truth pulled my fingers forward. I parted the fabric just enough to see. My breath left my lungs entirely. Inside, on the sofa Travis saved 2 years to buy, on the blanket I knitted for their first Christmas as a married couple, Harold and Maribel were wrapped around each other with a hunger so raw it made my vision blur. Their bodies pressed together, their skin flushed, his hands gripping her as if she belonged to him. She arched toward him, her face soft, eyes closed, mouth parted in pleasure. It wasn't just betrayal. It was possession. It was desire. It was everything a husband should never give to anyone but his wife, and certainly never to his son's wife. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to keep from crying out. The storm drowned most sounds, but my knees hitting the wooden porch sent a dull thud through the floorboards. And that tiny noise, that single, pitiful noise was enough.
Inside, Harold froze. Maribel's eyes snapped open.
Their expressions shifted from ecstasy to terror in the time it took for thunder to rumble again.
I didn't wait.
I pushed the door open so hard it slammed into the wall, shaking the framed photos beside it. A violent gust of wind burst into the room, carrying rainwater onto the hardwood floor. Harold and Maribel scrambled, clutching blankets, tripping over pillows, their faces blotchy and panicked.
Harold's voice cracked. Evelintes isn't just listen.
I didn't let him finish. Months of doubt, sleepless nights, self-blame, and the slow unraveling of my sanity all erupted at once. My scream tore from my throat as if ripped out by fire.
You filthy, shameless traitors.
I lunged not gracefully, not rationally, but with the force of a woman whose entire life had just been smashed like glass on concrete. My hand connected with Maribel's cheek before I even realized I'd swung. She shrieked, stumbling backward. Then I turned on Harold. My fists beat against his chest, my voice breaking with every word.
How could you?
How could you do this to Travis?
To me?
To our family? Harold didn't defend himself. He didn't yell back. He just sank to his knees, hands raised as if surrendering to judgment. Please, he whispered, tears streaking down his cheeks.
Please, Dawn, let the neighbors hear. Evelyn, I'm begging you.
Don't ruin us publicly.
Dawn, ruin us. As if I were the ruin.
Behind him, Maribel curled into the corner of the sofa, covering herself with trembling hands, sobbing into the blanket she had laughed into moments before. I stood there, drenched, shaking, surrounded by warmth that suddenly felt suffocating and foreign. The room smelled of sweat and cologne, a sickening combination that made my stomach heave.
My voice came out ragged.
Swear to me. Swear this ends now. They both nodded frantically, weeping, promising, swearing up and down that it was a mistake, that they had lost control, that it would never happen again, that no one else would ever know. They begged me to keep Travis safe from the truth. They begged me to protect the family's dignity. They begged me not to destroy what little we had left. And in that terrible, shattering moment, I made the worst decision of my life. I stayed quiet. I told them I would bury everything if they ended whatever they had done.
For the sake of Travis. For the sake of the Monroe name. For the sake of keeping our world from falling apart.
But as I left that house, soaked to the bone, shaking uncontrollably, I knew deep inside that something poisonous had already taken root. Something that would grow and twist and tear everything apart long before any of us realized the worst was yet to come. Because infidelity ends in shame. But secrets end in disaster. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. Each morning I woke with the same fear sitting on my chest, heavy as the humid Ohio air in midsummer. I tried to pretend things had returned to normal, that Harold had cut all ties with the disaster I'd witnessed, that the promises he and Maribel made shaking, half-naked, sobbing meant anything at all. But the truth is, once you've seen a betrayal like that, nothing ever looks the same again. Every gesture becomes suspicious.
Every quiet moment feels like a lie waiting to bloom.
I tried to forgive in silence, as I had sworn I would, but every night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that terrible secret pressing down until my ribs ached.
Then one morning, Travis came home.
He walked into the house with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face sunburnt from long days on the job, his eyes bright with the relief of being near his wife again. He wrapped me in a hug so tight I felt his heartbeat thumping against my chest, unaware that I was holding together a truth sharp enough to cut him in half. Seeing him like that gentle, hopeful, full of love for the family he believed he had nearly undid me. I felt like I was being asked to hold back the tide with my bare hands. That night we invited him for dinner at our house. Harold sat stiffly at the table, barely touching his food, his hands trembling slightly when he passed the salt. I noticed Maribel glance toward him several times, her cheeks turning pink, her eyes darting away whenever he shifted in his seat. The tension between them was a living thing, breathing, swelling, threatening to burst. And then, in the middle of dinner, Maribel laid down her fork, took a deep breath, and said gently, "Travis, I think we're finally going to be parents."
The words struck me like a hammer.
Travis froze, staring at her as if she had spoken a miracle into existence.
"You re-pregnant?" His voice cracked, hope and shock tangled together.
When she nodded, he stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. He rushed to her, pulled her into his arms, and let out a laugh so pure, so full of gratitude, that tears sprang to my eyes. For 5 years they had tried doctor appointments, tests, supplements, tears, and nothing had ever worked.
And now, out of nowhere, this sudden spark of hope.
But while Travis rejoiced, I looked at Harold. His face had gone pale. His fork clattered from his fingers onto the plate. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. And when he finally looked up, our eyes met just for a second, no more. But in that second, I saw something unmistakable. Fear. Recognition. Guilt. Maribel, too, avoided my gaze, her lips trembling slightly as Travis kissed her cheek again and again. She placed a hand over her stomach, but the gesture wasn't tender. It was guarded. Something inside me snapped into clarity. I began counting backwards. 2 months. 8 weeks. Exactly the time since I'd caught them in each other's arms. The exact window when the betrayal had reached its ugliest, rawest point. My fingers tightened around my glass until I thought it would shatter. I could no longer silence the voice whispering the truth I didn't want to hear. The child might not be Travis's. After Travis went home with Maribel that night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room, running through every possible explanation, every slim hope that the timing was a coincidence, that I was being paranoid, that I wasn't about to witness yet another devastation unfold. But the more I tried to reason, the clearer the truth became. The pieces fit too perfectly. So the next morning, before the sun had even risen, I made my decision.
I called Maribel.
"Sweetheart," I said, forcing my voice into something gentle, "we need to take you for prenatal testing. Early screening. It's important for the baby." She hesitated. I heard her breath catch. She knew what I was really asking.
She knew I knew.
I don't think it's necessary yet," she whispered. "It is," I said, my voice turning sharp despite my effort. "We need to make sure the baby is healthy. I'll pick you up at 10. She didn't argue again. The drive to the clinic was suffocatingly quiet. Maribel sat stiffly beside me, her hands clasped in her lap so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I could feel the tremor in her breathing. She didn't look at me once. I didn't speak either. If I had spoken, I would have screamed. The test was done in silence. The nurse explained the procedure gently, unaware that the real battle wasn't medical, it was moral. It was the difference between truth and the collapse of everything I still hoped to save. When the results came back a week later, they arrived in a crisp white envelope, thicker than it needed to be. My hands shook so violently I had to sit down at the kitchen table before opening it. I whispered a prayer, not for mercy, but for clarity. For the strength to face whatever was coming.
I slid my finger under the seal.
The paper inside unfolded like a sentence being passed. Probability of paternity, 99.9% match with Harold Monroe.
My vision blurred.
The paper slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor like a fallen feather, soft and devastating. My chest tightened until it felt like my heart was trying to claw its way out.
Harold's child.
Not Travis's.
Not my son's baby.
My husband's. I felt the room tilt.
I gripped the table, gasping for air.
For a moment, I thought I might faint, or scream, or collapse entirely. Instead, I picked up the paper, walked into the living room, and placed it on the coffee table where Harold sat watching television with blank, faraway eyes. He saw the envelope. Then the paper. Then the words.
His lips parted.
His face drained. He whispered, "Evelyn, please." But there was nothing left to say.
Nothing left to save.
That evening, we gathered at Travis's house. I insisted. Harold dragged his feet the entire walk, as if hoping the ground would swallow him before we arrived. Maribel waited inside, her face pale, her hands shaking. I placed the test results on the table between us all. Travis picked it up, smiling at first, thinking it was routine prenatal paperwork. But his smile faltered, then crumbled, then shattered completely as he read. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open. He looked from Harold to Maribel, his expression twisting into something raw and unrecognizable. "No, no," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't no." Then something inside him broke. He let out a howl so piercing it felt like the windows might crack. He staggered back, knocking over a chair, clutching his head as if trying to rip out the reality forced upon him. He stumbled into the yard, screaming, laughing, crying all at once, moving like a man whose mind had just unraveled thread by thread.
"Travis!"
I screamed, running after him, but I couldn't reach him. He sprinted into the street, shouting nonsense, gripping his hair, eyes wild, unseeing.
Neighbors came out.
Someone called for help. 2 men restrained him before he hurt himself, and even then he kept laughing high, broken, empty. My chest tightened abruptly.
The world dimmed.
Pain shot down my arm and across my ribs. My heart seized. I felt myself collapsing, the cold ground rising up to meet me.
Somewhere in the distance, I heard sirens. Someone calling my name.
Harold crying.
Maribel sobbing. Travis's manic laughter echoing down the street like a ghost.
And as the darkness swallowed me, one final thought pulsed through my fading consciousness. Secrets don't just break families. They destroy them. When I finally woke in the hospital, hooked to 4 lines, surrounded by beeping machines and the sharp scent of disinfectant, I didn't know how much time had passed. Hours? Days? My chest still ached from the heart attack, and my mind felt fogged with medication, but even through the haze, I sensed something in the world beyond my hospital window had shifted again, tilted further into darkness. I asked for Travis. The nurse's expression tightened. She told me he had been admitted to the psychiatric ward of another facility, sedated and monitored closely. His mental collapse had been sudden, violent, heartbreaking. I felt tears burn the corners of my eyes, but the medication kept them from falling. My sunny sweet, hard-working boy had lost his mind because of a secret I couldn't hold together any longer. And as I lay there, unable to move without pain, I wondered whether Harold had gone to see him, to apologize, to explain, to at least try to repair what he had helped destroy. But when Harold entered my hospital room that night, his face pale, his eyes hollow, I knew he had done nothing of the sort. He stood beside my bed with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, as if afraid to get too close. "Evelyn," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I know I should have," he trailed off. His voice shook, but not with grief for himself perhaps, not for the devastation he'd caused. I turned my face toward the window. "Leave," I whispered. "I don't have the strength to look at you." He didn't argue. He simply walked out, shoulders slumped, closing the door behind him with a soft, shameful click. And just like that, 40 years of marriage felt like dust slipping through my fingers. For the next week, I relearned how to breathe through pain. Nurses adjusted my medication, checked my vitals, helped me sit up, helped me walk a few steps at a time. But something else was happening while I lay trapped in that hospital bed, something darker, crueler, something I never imagined even Harold could sink into. Maribel started visiting him. At first, she came quietly, slipping through the back door of our house, pretending to check on him, bringing him homemade soup, folding his laundry, talking to him softly when he thought no one could hear. A neighbor later told me she'd seen Maribel's car parked in our driveway every other day, even late at night. I didn't know any of this yet, but in the weeks to come, every detail would fall into place like puzzle pieces of a picture too horrifying to ignore. One afternoon, while I was still hospitalized, Harold sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, replaying the last month of his life like a film that had grown too grotesque to bear. That was when Maribel arrived. She walked into the house with quiet footsteps, her belly already showing the faintest curve, her face pale and drawn. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap like a sorrowful widow visiting a grieving man. "You look tired," she murmured, her voice soft as velvet.
Have you eaten today?
Harold shook his head.
I can think. I can sleep. I ruined everything. Travis, Evelyn, the baby, his voice cracked.
I don't know how to fix any of this. Maribel leaned forward, her eyes wide and glistening with manufactured pity. You're not alone, she whispered. I'm here. And this child, he needs you. He needs his father. Harold swallowed hard. I wish things were different. They can be, she breathed. Those 3 words became the poison that slowly seeped into the cracks of Harold's guilt. Maribel began weaving her web. She told him that Travis would never recover, that the baby needed stability, that the scandal would grow worse if anyone ever found out the truth, that the only way to protect the child was to create a new family, one that didn't involve me. She insinuated that I was too fragile, too weak, too old to deal with the aftermath of all this. She told Harold that I deserved peace, that he deserved a fresh start, that fate had brought them together for a reason. Later, when Harold confessed these conversations to me, I felt physically ill. Because I know now, and even he seemed to realize too late, that everything she said was designed to break down the last defenses of a man drowning in guilt.
Maribel touched his hand.
You're the father of my child, she whispered. We can't hide that forever.
It will destroy us.
We need to make things right. Harold, already emotionally shattered, allowed himself to believe her poison. Meanwhile, I lay in my hospital bed believing that when I returned home, Harold would try to rebuild what he had destroyed.
I imagined quiet conversations, therapy, apologies, tears.
I thought he might even try to care for Travis in whatever fragile state he was in. But when the doctor finally discharged me and I stepped out into the brisk Ohio air, the last thing I expected was the bombshell waiting for me. Harold met me in the driveway, his face ashen. Evelyn, he said, barely above a whisper. We need to talk inside. I followed him into the house. The living room felt unfamiliar, colder somehow. The air was thick, heavy. He handed me a stack of divorce papers already signed by him.
My hands shook uncontrollably. What is this?
I'm sorry, he whispered, staring at the floor like a child caught stealing.
Maribel, she needs me.
The baby needs me.
She is carrying my son, Evelyn.
My only son.
My breath caught in my throat. Your only son?
Travis is your son, I snapped, my voice trembling with disbelief and heartbreak. Harold winced but didn't retract his words.
I felt the world tilt beneath me.
I gripped the back of the sofa, fighting to stay upright.
You leaving me to marry your son's wife?
He swallowed hard. I don't expect you to understand. I understood more than he realized. I saw right through Maribel's plan, now her gentle voice, her trembling hands, her carefully crafted helplessness. It was a performance, all of it. And Harold had become the star of her twisted play. Still, I nodded. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply picked up the pen and signed the papers. There's a kind of numbness that settles in when a heart shatters, for the last to me a numbness that feels strangely similar to peace. Within a week, the divorce was finalized. Maribel filed her own papers to separate from Travis on grounds of medical instability. She used his breakdown, something she helped Kelsey as her escape route. And then, in an act that shook our small Ohio neighborhood to its core, she and Harold held a quiet, humiliating wedding ceremony, just the two of them at the courthouse. No guests. No flowers. No vows worth hearing. Just a legal binding of a man who had lost everything to a woman who had orchestrated it from the start. The community whispered behind closed doors. Some called Harold sick. Others said Maribel was a manipulative homewrecker. But whispers meant nothing now. My marriage was gone. My son was lost in a psychiatric ward. And my former daughter-in-law, pregnant with my husband's child, now stood as the new Mrs.
Monroe.
And I sat alone in my empty living room that night, the silence so thick it felt like it might swallow me whole. For the first time in my life, I understood that grief can feel worse than death because it keeps you alive to feel every lash of the pain. But deep in my bones, I also sensed something else. This was not the end of the destruction. It was only the beginning. The weeks after Harold married Maribel felt like drifting through a nightmare that refused to end. I stayed in my small house alone, moving from room to room like a ghost without purpose. Every familiar object, the framed family photos, the ceramic mug Travis made in 6th grade, the heavy wool blanket I knit during my first pregnancy, felt like artifacts of a life that had quietly died behind my back. I tried to remind myself to breathe, to eat, to sleep, but nothing felt real. My marriage had crumbled, my son remained locked inside a psychiatric facility, and the woman who had set fire to all our lives was now legally tied to my husband, wearing the name I had carried for 40 years. But while I was grieving, Maribel was plotting. And Harold, too blinded by guilt and lust, didn't see the traps being laid for him until it was far too late. After their courthouse wedding, they moved back into the house Harold and I once shared, the home where we raised Travis, the home where every wall held memories of laughter and Christmas mornings and birthday candles. Seeing Maribel living there, cooking in my kitchen, sitting on my sofa, sleeping in my bed, it nearly broke me. I couldn't bring myself to step inside anymore. The very air felt contaminated. But Maribel embraced her new role with alarming ease. She slipped seamlessly into Harold's life, offering him soft-spoken support, tender glances, careful touches that fed his ego and soothed his conscience. She played the part of the devoted new wife, even as she began steering him toward the next phase of her plan. It started subtly. She would sigh as she looked over bills, telling Harold she was worried about managing finances once the baby arrived. She would mention how difficult it would be to file medical paperwork when assets were scattered across old accounts. She'd lay her hand on her growing belly and whisper, "I just want our child to have security. Isn't that what every father wants?" She chose her words carefully, never pushy, always gentle, always framing herself as a vulnerable young expectant mother who needed stability. And Harold, desperate to prove he was doing the right thing, fell for every syllable. Soon, Maribel encouraged Harold to visit lawyers, first for estate planning, then for property restructuring, then for updating beneficiary lists. She told him that, as a new father, he needed to think responsibly. She painted a picture of a peaceful future, one where their child would grow up without worry, one where Harold's legacy would be safe. He didn't realize that what she was truly securing was not the baby's future but her own. Within 2 months, She convinced him to sign the first property over to her name, a rental duplex he owned on the east side of Columbus. He hesitated at first, mumbling something about letting the baby inherit it later, but she gently placed his hand on her stomach and whispered, "You're doing this for him. You're giving him a good life." Harold's guilt made him malleable. His loneliness made him weak. His desire to believe that he could repair the damage he'd caused pushed him into stupidity. And so he signed again and again and again. A few days later, she asked him to transfer ownership of the house they lived in for tax purposes. Then she asked him to move all joint savings into a new account she could manage efficiently for the household. She even convinced him to give her power of attorney, in case anything happened during the delivery. Every step was executed with surgical precision. And Harold signed every paper she handed him. He never asked a lawyer to review documents. He never questioned the details. He never paused long enough to realize he was handing over everything he owned to a woman who had already proven she was capable of destroying his life. Meanwhile, neighbors noticed Maribel's behavior shifting. She was still sweet to Harold, but only in public. Behind closed doors, yelling seeped through the windows. One neighbor claimed she heard Maribel berating him, calling him useless, old, pathetic. Another said she saw Maribel arguing with a younger man near the backyard fence late at night, a man who disappeared quickly when spotted. Rumors spread. People whispered. But Harold, quiet and withdrawn, brushed off questions. He believed lover what he mistook for love would save him. He believed the baby in Maribel's belly was his redemption. He believed he was building a new family that would rewrite the sins of the past. And then, one morning, the illusion shattered completely. Harold woke up to sunlight filling the bedroom, the silence unusually thick. He reached out toward Maribel's side of the bed and found it empty. He called out for her, his voice cracking slightly, but the house didn't answer. He rose, walked to the bathroom, then to the kitchen, his anxiety rising with every step. The kitchen table was bare. A half-eaten bowl of cereal sat in the sink. The back door was locked. Something was off, and his body felt it before his mind caught up. He went to the bedroom closet. Maribel's clothes were gone. He rushed to the living room. Her shoes gone. He checked the dresser. Every piece of her jewelry gone. His breath grew shallow. He stumbled toward the office where he kept the safe. The moment he pushed the door open, his heart dropped to his stomach. The safe was wide open. Empty. Papers scattered across the floor like discarded confetti after a cruel celebration. He tore through drawers, cabinets, closets. Everything of value was gone: documents, cash, gold jewelry he'd inherited from his mother, even the watch he'd received after 30 years in his business. It was only then he noticed the letter on the kitchen counter. A single sheet of paper. No envelope. No signature. Just 2 lines written in chilling simplicity. The baby ISN, to yours. Goodbye. Harold collapsed onto the floor, letting out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and not quite a sob, something raw, primal, the sound of a man being gutted by truth. He clawed at the paper, crumpling it in his fists, shaking uncontrollably. He drove to the bank, still in his slippers, wearing a jacket only half-zipped. When he reached the teller, she frowned in confusion, then pity. His accounts had been emptied days earlier. Every joint account had been transferred to Maribel's personal account and then closed. His retirement savings gone. His safety net gone. The house they lived in? Sold. The deed had been transferred weeks before. The sale was finalized yesterday. He had nothing left. Not a dollar. Not a home. Not a family. The teller called security when Harold dropped to the floor in shock, whispering, "She took everything. Everything." Hours later, The new owners of the house arrived with their moving truck and told him he needed to leave immediately. A man who once owned multiple properties, who once provided for his family, now stood on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, holding nothing but a crumpled note in his shaking hand. Neighbors watched from their windows as Harold sank to his knees in the yard, sobbing into his palms, calling Maribel's name through tears that dissolved in the cold wind. But Maribel was already hundreds of miles away. She had fled with the young man she'd been secretly seeing long before Harold ever stepped foot in her trap. Together, they disappeared into a new city, Tampa, Florida, carrying every cent Harold had ever worked for. And Harold? He became a man stripped of everything: money, dignity, marriage, home, identity. By the end of the week, he walked the streets of Columbus with a torn coat and trembling hands, searching for shelter, for forgiveness, for something that might hold together the shattered remains of his existence. I heard about all of this from neighbors, from police reports, from whispers that reached my door long before Harold himself did. And when he finally showed up on my porch days later, rain soaking his clothes, eyes red and empty, I didn't open the door. Because the truth is, sometimes betrayal destroys a heart so thoroughly. There is no door left to open. Maribel and the young man she had secretly been involved with, his name was Derek Holt, a wiry, sharp-eyed drifter 10 years younger than she was, left Ohio in the middle of the night. They drove south for nearly 15 hours without stopping except for gas, racing away from the ruins they had left behind. Harold's money funded everything: the full tank, the takeout meals, the motel rooms, even the new clothes Maribel insisted on buying the moment they crossed into Kentucky. She laughed as she threw her old things into a dumpster, calling them the last traces of a boring life. Derek laughed with her, grabbing her waist, kissing her neck, telling her she was brilliant, beautiful, unstoppable. But cruelty is a boomerang. It always finds its way back to the one who throws it. By the time they reached Tampa, Florida, Maribel imagined her new life laid out before her like a glittering highway. She pictured a condo near the beach, warm breezes, expensive dinners, a bank account bursting with cash, and Derek, younger, more exciting man wrapped around her finger. She envisioned strolling the shoreline in sundresses, spending Harold's money without restraint, feeling reborn. For a moment, it almost seemed possible. But dreams built on stolen ground collapse faster than the tide. Within 2 weeks, Maribel realized Derek wasn't the adoring lover she believed he was. He had grown restless, already jealous, irritated, easily angered. He complained that she whined too much, that she was slowing him down, that her pregnancy made her too needy. He told her he wasn't ready to play stepfather to a child that wasn't his, and resented her exhaustion, her mood swings, her frequent nausea. The more irritated he became, the more Maribel clung to the idea of her unborn baby as a weapon of control. But the reality of pregnancy, especially one created through betrayal and panic, was becoming too heavy for her to bear. The pregnancy drained her strength, forced her to stay indoors, made her dependent on Derek in ways he didn't want.
Tension grew like mold on the motel walls.
"Get rid of it," Derek snapped one night, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "I'm not dragging along some old man's kid."
It is killing the vibe. Maribel breath hitched.
"It's my baby." "It's a burden," he corrected coldly. "And it needs to go." Those words echoed in her mind long after the argument died down. She had never intended to keep the baby forever. It had been nothing more than leverage, a stepping stone to Harold's wealth. But now she'd already taken everything. The baby had lost its usefulness. And so, in the most twisted moment of her life, Maribel finally agreed. She would end the pregnancy. She didn't dare go to a real clinic, afraid someone might recognize her name. Instead, Derek found a cheap, disreputable specialist who operated in a converted storage unit behind a strip mall. The floor was stained, the air smelled of bleach and old blood, and the equipment looked decades old. But Maribel, consumed by fear and desperation, lay down on the cold metal table anyway. When the procedure began, she squeezed her eyes shut, biting her lip to keep from screaming. Derek waited outside, smoking, scrolling his phone, bored. He never heard the moment everything went wrong.
A sharp pain tore through Maribel's abdominal, pain so violent she sat up mid-procedure, knocking over a tray of instruments.
Blood poured down her legs, warm and fast. Her pulse raced.
Her Vision blurred. The room tilted.
She began gasping for air, one hand clutching her stomach as if she could hold herself together through sheer will. The doctor, little more than a reckless amateur, panicked, yelling for Derek as Maribel collapsed onto the floor. Derek barged in, swore loudly, grabbed her under her arms, and dragged her to the car. They sped to the nearest emergency room, where Maribel was rushed inside while Derek lied about what had happened, claiming she fell and started bleeding out of nowhere. The truth, however, revealed itself quickly. The infection had already begun. She was septic. Her uterus was damaged beyond repair. The doctors fought for hours to save her life, but when the chaos settled, they informed her she would never be able to carry a child again. She spent days drifting in and out of consciousness. Sweat soaked her sheets. Her skin grew pale and clammy.
Every breath hurt.
Every movement felt like punishment. And Derek? He came only twice. The first time, he complained about the mounting medical bills. The second time, he cleaned out the motel room, took all the remaining money Harold had worked decades for, and vanished without leaving a note. When Maribel was finally discharged, she had nowhere to go. Her savings were gone. Her lover was gone. Her unborn baby was gone. The infection left her weak, nauseous, and covered in patches of irritated, peeling skin. She rented a room in a decrepit motel with the last $120 she had managed to hide from Derek. The walls were stained. The ceiling leaked. The mattress smelled of mold. She lay there for days, staring at the ceiling fan as it wobbled dangerously overhead. For the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of her own choices. The nights were the worst. Fevered dreams dragged her into memories she wished she could erase. She saw Travis's face the day she told him she was pregnant, hopeful, trembling, bright. She heard his scream when he read the DNA results. She saw Harold kneeling on the lawn as neighbors watched him fall apart, crying like a lost child. Then she saw me, standing in the rain, staring through the curtain at the two of them on the sofa. My heart breaking silently.
My hands shaking. My life cracking open.
Maribel tried to push away those images, but the fever made them vivid, punishing, relentless. She whispered apologies into the empty motel room, but no one heard. No one answered. As the infection worsened, her world shrank to a thin mattress and a flickering lamp. Her skin blistered.
Her legs ached.
She coughed until her throat burned. She spent hours crying into a pillow, her tears mixing with sweat. Her breath grew shallow.
Her Vision blurred.
She wondered if she was dying. She wondered if she deserved to. Days later, a motel housekeeper found her barely conscious and called an ambulance. She was taken to the hospital again, her condition critical. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes mumbling, sometimes hallucinating. And in one of those feverish dreams, she told the nurse everything. The affair. The pregnancy.
The manipulation.
The money. The abortion. The lies. The ruin. But by then, no confession could fix anything. I had already died quietly, alone, in my small home weeks after Harold lost everything. My body, weakened by stress and heartbreak, simply couldn't withstand another blow.
A neighbor found me when my mail piled up.
Travis remained in the psychiatric facility, trapped in a fractured world from which he might never fully return. Harold had become a wandering drifter, sleeping behind grocery stores, begging for change, mumbling apologies to no one. Maribel, laying on her hospital bed in Tampa, finally learned the truth from a social worker who tracked down emergency contacts. There was no one left to return to. No Harold.
No Evelyn.
No Travis. No family. No child. No lover. No money. She had burned every bridge, broken every heart, destroyed every life including her own. On the final night of her life, she slipped into a half-conscious state, whispering something no one fully understood. Her breath rattled softly. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids. She reached one trembling hand toward the empty air beside her, as if trying to grasp something she had long abandoned. And with her last fading thought, she saw a tiny silhouette child, no bigger than a shadow, standing at the foot of her bed, crying with a grief that did not belong to this world.
Maribel let out a final, shuddering sigh.
And the darkness claimed her.
Cruelty always circles back.
And when it does, it collects more than what was taken.